Welcome to STEPS, a staff training program run by the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and I know this step seems absolutely self-evident. Our session today is titled, How do you know when your student has finished their PhD? Well, they finished, obviously, when they say they're finished. But is that the case? I've always said that the toughest bit of supervision is knowing that that supposedly final draft that we're reading, is it quality? Is it standard? Is it over the line? So that draft will pass without corrections or minor or major corrections. But where is that line? And how are we really sure? And no matter how many students I complete, this is always a pretty terrifying decision. As I've always said, beginnings matter, but endings matter a lot more. And at the beginning of a PhD, everything is incredibly exciting. At the end of a PhD, you want to throw your computer out of the window or trash the photocopier. Emotionally, the happy, joy moment is over. And instead we have anger, resentment, depression, hatred, self-hatred, fear, worry, anxiety, all the good stuff bubbles in the cauldron of completions. Students are stressed. Supervisors are stressed, and as I always say, the final 3 months of a candidature are the worst moments of our lives. As supervisors, we repetitively have to experience these worst moments over and over and over again, so it really is like Groundhog Day in a meth lab. So yes, beginnings matter, but endings matter more, and endings are deep moments, pivots of our entire life, where one reality ends and another begins. And that's why there is a sizable minority of students that really don't want to finish. The thesis is ready to go, and they're clinging to this prior reality. They're emotionally unable to submit the thesis. So how do we know that we are at the end of a PhD? And I'm going to answer that question in a few ways in this STEP program. I'm going to look at reading and research, I'm going to look at writing and drafting, but also contextual matters. Remember too that the end of a thesis is not a time to make great decisions. So students are tired, we're tired, and so I'm trying to find some proxies to put in place to look for. So in this STEP session, here are 5 proxies or nodes of discussion or nodes of thought for you to consider. So how do you know your student is finished? Proxy 1. The student has answered the research questions. The student has finished their thesis when the research questions are answered. And of course, the student is able to write a powerful conclusion that shows how those research questions are answered. And that's why, as early as possible, I get my students to develop as tight and clear a set of research questions as possible. I also ask them, particularly before their confirmation of candidature, to have a go at the sentence that reads, my original contribution to knowledge is, and they're able to finish that sentence. And they also have a clearly bounded research design. Then they're able to show why these research questions have scaffolded an original contribution to knowledge. So if they can link the research questions to the original contribution to knowledge, bang, thanks for playing, we've completed. And let's go to proxy 2. And this one is about deadlines, and yes, it is about money. Proxy 2, set a date and keep to that date. This is particularly important for students on scholarship. Let me tell you why, and this might surprise you. Only 1/3 of our students at Flinders University are on scholarship, and internationally that's a pretty high figure. I know our friends in the United Kingdom shake their heads that actually we have so many students on scholarship. But let me tell you what happens to those students on scholarship. Let me give you another data point before I hit the narrative. When I look at overtime students, so the students that have gone beyond their maximum candidature, that list is dominated by students that were formerly on scholarships. So, the students that the university and the taxpayers have supported financially are over time. Now, I know that seems incredibly counterintuitive, so let me tell you what happens. A student enrolls in a PhD with a scholarship. They do not complete as much work as is required in the first year, and that delay cascades. At 3 years, perhaps with an extension to 3 years, 6 months, they still haven't finished. So they switch to part-time. The money from the scholarship stops, and they're scratching around for dough. They're then focusing on the thesis full-time, and they're paid to do that, and they're used to that commitment on scholarship. And then, of course, moving to part-time, they haven't got that focus. And the stress of that change from full-time to part-time and having to make a living creates mental health issues, and they end up in counselling. The problems continue. They click over the 4 years of enrolment. They're now officially over time, and now they panic that they don't have the capacity to finish. So this is the pattern. This is the narrative. So what has happened here is actually there was no due date. The scholarship made them satisfied, perhaps complacent. They had the money. It was cool. And all of a sudden it wasn't cool, and a mess resulted. The reason that we have milestones and the reason that we have a due date is so that we can plan. You can backwardly map as a supervisor and actually have a plan in place to get the students to that due date. And if the students don't have a date, they don't have milestones, they don't backwardly map, they simply drift. So for those of us who have students with the privilege of being on scholarship, the submission date has been given to us, and it is the date that the scholarship ends. And if we don't do that, if we don't have a plan, then we have a clear sense of that narrative of what is going to happen next. So the submission date is the date the scholarship ends, and we need to name it at the start, work hard to reach that goal, and yes, submit on that date. And if we as supervisors don't enable that completion, then mental health, lack of money will cascade after that date has passed. And just a reminder, in case you misheard me, the students who gained a scholarship dominate the overtime scholars. So that means the students with support became complacent without the pressure of a deadline. Proxy 3, reading and research. This is a powerful one. How do our students know that they've read enough? And of course, for all of us as scholars, how do we know that we've read enough and to stop reading? And for me, there are two characteristics. Students start to read the same authors, the same tropes, the same ideas for a third time. So they loop for the third time. So by the time students, supervisors do the sweep and confront the same issues for the third time, really the students are done. They know the field. And if students keep reading and are still being surprised, then they should keep reading. But we know if they're finding the same ideas, they've got it, then that's enough reading. They're finished. They can write up. And speaking of writing, let's move to Proxy 4, writing and drafting. As we all know, there's no such thing as a perfect sentence or a perfect paragraph or a perfect PhD. But the thesis must be solidly written, with the focus on strong communication of ideas. We have to ensure that the student's structure is effective. The chapters work well together and the transition between the chapters is strong. Also, the abstract is sharp and clear. The introduction sets a scene and confirms the original contribution to knowledge. Also, the conclusion conveys the arc of the research. We must not submit a thesis with spelling and grammatical errors. And I think we know the students will be punished, which really means the supervisors will be punished, and the reports will list every error that has been made. So to be frank with you, in my last check, my last draft, I put a spelling checker through it, and I make sure that the sentences are grammatically correct and the paragraphing develops the argument. And really, that's all that's required, the solid consistency of writing. And once that stage has been reached, then bang, it's time to submit. No one is expecting or wanting Austen or Shakespeare or E. Cummings or Tolkien. It is a PhD, so it must be solid, consistent, grammatically correct, and it must signpost the argument. So when we have that, the student is ready to submit. I think the challenge emerges through the drafting process when students become emotionally attached to the thesis. And that's why I use the 10 draft model that's the focus of Another Step program. Now, 10 is not a magic number. I've accidentally picked that. But what it does do is it places a template over this emotional moment for our students. So it's just simply a matter of the students working through the drafts, and then they can let the thesis go. So if the student is feeling emotionally distressed about writing and drafting, then I put the thesis through 10 drafts, and then once the 10 are finished, submit it when it's done. And that takes the emotions out of the drafting and the editing, so it allows them to treat the words almost like they're written by somebody else. So the final advice I'd offer in this step is about how to know when the students are finished, not quantitatively or clearly. It's not a tip or a trick. It really is about an intellectual landscape. How do students know when they finish that PhD? And that is 5. Has the student today occupied the edge of knowledge, experience and expertise to construct that thesis? I think it is always the dream to create some metrics or something measurable. How do you know your student's ready in terms of structure or writing or research? And look, we can determine it in terms of research design and research questions. In terms of research, the student has the main names, the shape of the debate. We can see the research material there. The data sets are of scope and scale. But this final tip is really about a sensation, if you will, the edge of expertise. And can I say this not only happens in higher degrees, as we all know, it's also a characteristic of scholarly monographs as well. We know that knowledge never finishes, research never finishes, learning never finishes. But of course research projects do. Nothing is ever perfect, nothing is ever a masterpiece, but we need to find a way to be satisfied, not in the perfection, but in the piece of work at this particular time. So what I do with myself, but also with my students, is I do an intellectual stock taking at the end of every project. Every project could produce another 10 tentacles, 10 other sub-themes or further ideas, but there needs to be a stop. There needs to be an end. So I do this by asking myself one question. Is this the best that I can do now? Is this the best of my thinking today? These questions exist for a reason, because they allow me to forgive myself for any omissions that I might see in this work in the future. I give myself the space to grow and improve into my next project, but I also congratulate myself that this work is the best I can produce at this point of my life. I often describe doctoral theses in books as intellectual photographs. They capture our intellectual development at this particular point. The moment after the photograph is taken, we change. And that's normal and that's right. So we need to recognise that this PhD is the best thinking of our students at this particular point. And they're going to move and they're going to change and they're going to transform. The PhD is a photograph of a research moment. So we ask our students to take that photograph, acknowledge it, and then move on to the next thing. And that's how our students finish, with rigour, with clarity, and indeed some peace. Thank you for listening to this STEPS training program on behalf of the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University.